What if the person meant to defend you was actually working against you? What if your own lawyer, the one you trusted, was secretly trying to make sure you lost? This is exactly what happened to a man named Marcus. A hard-working father, a regular guy who believed in the system. But the system didn't believe in him. It all started when Marcus was accused of a crime he didn't commit. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time. The police arrested him, and suddenly, his life turned upside down. He knew he was innocent, but proving it wouldn't be easy. Enter Richard Langley, a top lawyer, experienced, respected. But behind closed doors, he had a different side. Richard didn't see Marcus as a client, he saw him as a criminal. Not because of evidence, not because of facts, but because of the color of his skin. Marcus didn't know the truth about his own lawyer. He didn't know that Richard had no plans to help him. Instead, Richard was ready to do something unthinkable, lie about his own client. And soon, a shocking truth would change everything. Marcus sat in the cold courtroom, his hands clenched together. His lawyer, Richard Langley, stood beside him, dressed in an expensive suit, looking confident. To everyone else, Richard seemed like he was doing his job, but Marcus had no idea that his own lawyer was secretly working against him. The trial had just started, and the prosecution wasted no time painting Marcus as a dangerous man. They brought up his past, not crimes, just small mistakes, things anyone could have done. But in court, those mistakes were used to make him look guilty. Marcus turned to Richard, expecting him to fight back. That was his job, after all. But Richard barely said anything. When he did speak, his words were weak. He let the prosecution take control. He didn't challenge their claims. He ignored evidence that could help Marcus. At first, Marcus thought Richard had a strategy. Maybe he was waiting for the right moment. But as the case went on, something felt wrong. Richard wasn't just quiet, he was making mistakes. He forgot important details. He didn't call key witnesses. And worst of all, he told Marcus not to testify, saying it was too risky. Marcus felt uneasy. Something wasn't right. But he had no idea just how deep the betrayal went. Marcus sat alone in his jail cell, replaying the trial in his mind. Something didn't feel right. His lawyer was supposed to defend him. But it seemed like Richard was barely trying. Was it just bad lawyering, or was something more going on? Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Richard Langley was a completely different person. Away from the courtroom, he spoke freely about his client. In his private office, he laughed with his colleagues. "This case is already over," he smirked. "We all know how this ends." His colleagues chuckled, some uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge him. Richard didn't care if Marcus was innocent. In his mind, Marcus was guilty simply because of who he was. He believed people like Marcus didn't deserve a fair trial. And to make sure of that, Richard was willing to lie. One evening, Marcus was being led through the courthouse when he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. His lawyer's voice, coming from a nearby office. He couldn't make out everything, but he caught enough. "They'll believe what I tell them. He's just another one of them," Richard said. Marcus's heart pounded of them. What did that mean? For the first time, he truly understood. Richard wasn't just bad at his job, he was against him. He wasn't making mistakes. He was doing this on purpose. Marcus wanted to scream, to burst into the office and demand answers. But he had no proof. It was just his word against Richard's. And in that courtroom, he already knew whose word would matter more. But the truth has a way of coming out. And soon, something was about to happen that would change everything. Days passed, and Marcus felt trapped. He knew his lawyer was working against him, but he had no proof. No one would believe him. The trial was moving fast, and things weren't looking good. Then something unexpected happened. A woman named Lisa, a legal assistant at Richard's firm, had been reviewing case files. She wasn't supposed to question anything, just do her job. But while organizing documents, she found something strange, an eyewitness statement that had never been mentioned in court. The statement came from a store owner near the crime scene. He swore Marcus wasn't the person he saw that night. This was solid proof that Marcus was innocent. But the paper had been buried under other files, ignored. Lisa felt uneasy. Why wasn't this being used? Her curiosity led her to another shocking discovery. She found emails between Richard and the prosecution. They weren't just discussing the case, they were coordinating. Richard had been feeding them information, making sure Marcus lost. Her hands shook. She had always respected Richard, but this was illegal, it was unethical, and worst of all, it was intentional. Lisa knew she had a choice: stay quiet and keep her job, or speak up and risk everything. That night, she made her decision. She printed the files and took them straight to the judge's office. The next morning, court was in session. Everything seemed normal, until the judge suddenly paused the trial. He looked directly at Richard, his face unreadable. "We have a serious matter to address," the judge said. "Mr. Langley, can you explain why this evidence was never presented?" The courtroom fell silent. Richard's face turned pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Marcus sat up straight, his heart racing. What just happened? The shocking truth was finally coming out. And for the first time, Richard Langley wasn't in control. The courtroom was silent. Every eye was on Richard Langley. The judge's voice was firm. "Mr. Langley, I asked you a question. Why was this evidence not presented?" Richard shifted in his seat. His usual confidence was gone. He cleared his throat and forced a weak smile. "There must be some misunderstanding, Your Honor," he said. "I wasn't aware of this document." The judge frowned. "That's interesting, because this evidence came from your own office." Murmurs spread through the room. The prosecutor flipped through the papers, his face tightening. Even he hadn't seen this before. Lisa, sitting in the back, held her breath. She had done the right thing, but would it be enough? Marcus gripped the edge of the table. He had been waiting for this moment, but it still felt unreal. His own lawyer had lied, hidden proof, worked against him, and now, the truth was out. The judge turned to Marcus. "Mr. Carter, please step forward." Marcus stood. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "Your Honor, I've known something was wrong this whole time, but no one would listen. Now you have the proof." Richard interrupted, desperation creeping into his voice. "This is ridiculous. My client is guilty. This doesn't change. Enough." The judge's voice was sharp. "You don't get to decide that. The law does." The tension in the courtroom exploded. The jury whispered among themselves. The prosecution looked uneasy. The case was falling apart. Then, the judge did something no one expected. He turned to the bailiff. "Mr. Langley is to be placed under investigation immediately." Gasps filled the room. Richard's face drained of color. The judge continued. "This trial is suspended until further review." He looked at Marcus. "And as for you, Mr. Carter, you will not spend another night in that jail cell." Marcus felt his knees go weak. He wasn't free yet, but for the first time, there was hope. Richard Langley had spent his career controlling people's fates, but now his own fate was no longer in his hands. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Marcus could hardly believe what he had just heard. For weeks he had felt powerless, trapped in a system that seemed determined to crush him. But now everything was shifting. The truth had finally come out. Richard Langley sat frozen in his chair. His hands trembled as the bailiff stepped toward him. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had controlled so many cases before, twisting facts, bending the system to his will. But now, the system had turned on him. "Mr. Langley," the judge continued, "this court does not tolerate corruption. You will be investigated for misconduct and obstruction of justice." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had spent his career tearing down people like Marcus, believing no one would ever challenge him. But he had underestimated one thing: the power of truth. Lisa sat in the back of the courtroom, her heart pounding. She had risked everything by coming forward, but as she looked at Marcus, she knew she had done the right thing. Meanwhile, Marcus's lawyer was removed from the case, and a new attorney was assigned. Someone fair. Someone who actually wanted to defend him. Days later, a full review of Richard's past cases began. The findings were shocking. He had done this before, dozens of times. Evidence ignored, witnesses silenced, innocent people sent to prison. The media picked up the story. News channels flashed headlines: "Top lawyer exposed for corruption," and "Innocent man nearly convicted by racist attorney." People started coming forward, former clients, families of the wrongly convicted. They had always suspected something was wrong, but no one had listened. Now, they finally had proof. As the investigation continued, Richard was disbarred, his reputation was destroyed, he lost everything. But for Marcus, the damage had already been done. Even though he was finally declared innocent, the scars remained. He had spent months in jail for a crime he never committed. He had lost his job, his name had been dragged through the mud. Now, he had to start over. Walking out of the courthouse, Marcus took a deep breath. The world felt different, but the fight wasn't over. There were still so many others like him. People trapped in a broken system. And as he looked up at the sky, one thought stayed in his mind. How many more were still waiting for justice? Marcus stood outside the courthouse, staring at the world that had moved on without him. He was free, but he didn't feel victorious. The damage had been done. His name had been cleared, but his life had been shattered. He had lost his job. Friends had turned their backs on him. Some still whispered behind his back, as if the accusation alone was enough to stain him forever. But worst of all, he wasn't the only one. Marcus thought about the other men and women who didn't get a lucky break. People who had no one to uncover the truth for them. People who were still behind bars because their lawyers had failed them. Not by mistake, but by choice. He turned on his phone and scrolled through the news. His case was everywhere. But the focus wasn't just on him. It was on Richard Langley. Reports exposed years of misconduct, wrongful convictions, buried evidence, intimidated witnesses. He hadn't just failed Marcus, he had destroyed countless lives. And now, his past victims were stepping forward, demanding justice. Marcus's heart ached as he read their stories. A father who missed his daughter's childhood, a woman who had been locked away for a crime she didn't commit, a young man who had been given a life sentence based on lies. He realized something in that moment. This wasn't just about him, it never was. The justice system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as it had been designed to, built on bias, controlled by power, favoring some while crushing others. Marcus had spent so long fighting to prove his innocence. Now, he had a new fight. With the help of Lisa, the legal assistant who had exposed Richard's lies, Marcus began to connect with organizations that fought for the wrongly convicted. He told his story, not for attention, but to make sure this didn't happen to someone else. Weeks passed. Richard Langley was officially charged with misconduct, fraud, and conspiracy. He tried to fight back, but the evidence was overwhelming. The same system he had once manipulated was now working against him. For Marcus, watching Richard fall wasn't satisfying. It didn't erase what happened. It didn't give him back the time he lost. But it was a start. One day, Marcus sat down in front of a camera. He wasn't the kind of person who liked to speak out, but he knew he had to. He looked straight ahead and asked the world a question. How many more innocent people are out there, trapped in a system that's meant to protect them? The video went viral. People started talking. More cases were reopened. More lawyers were investigated. Marcus had been a victim, but now he was something more. He was a voice for those who hadn't been heard. And for the first time in a long time he felt hope, not just for himself, but for the future.